I want to begin by thanking Secretary Mayorkas for being here today. Mr. Secretary, your testimony before the committee, despite the unfounded extreme MAGA attacks against you, speaks to your character, integrity, and commitment to the Department of Homeland Security, its mission, and its people. In what seems like a split-screen day, this morning the committee is holding its annual hearing on the Department of Homeland Security's budget requests. This afternoon, Republican members will deliver to the Senate their baseless articles of impeachment in perhaps the most politicized partisan stunt this committee has ever engaged in. From the moment the Secretary took office in February 2021, members of the other side of the aisle have unfairly targeted him for their own political gain. Chairman Green promised donors at a campaign event that he would bring an impeachment case against Secretary Mayorkas. He told his contributors to get the popcorn and promised it's going to be fun. According to an internal Republican memo, Republicans had already scheduled a committee vote to impeach the Secretary prior to holding a hearing. This entire thing was a sham from the start. After two hastily thrown together so-called impeachment hearings that provided not even a shred of evidence of an impeachable offense, Republicans short-circuited their own markup and refused to let Democrats offer amendments in their rush to the House floor. In advance of the vote, the Secretary, who is Jewish and whose mother survived the Holocaust, was referred to using language the American Jewish Committee has included in its glossary of anti-Semitic terms. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record an article describing this incident. So ordered. The impeachment vote failed. In another embarrassing miscalculation of House Republican leadership, on a second try, Republicans limped their sham impeachment articles across the finish line. Over 2 months later, Republicans are still transmitting the impeachment articles to the Senate, having waited until they thought the timing was politically advantageous. So much for the claims of urgency about the border. They wanted to have a dog and pony show march into the Senate, showing yet again what deeply unserious people they are. The Senate should dismiss the baseless impeachment articles without delay. To make matters worse, in their zeal to impeach Secretary Mayorkas, Republicans have shirked their responsibility to conduct meaningful oversight of DHS and advance its many critical missions. Republicans have not yet held a single full committee oversight hearing on cybersecurity, domestic terrorism, aviation security, disaster preparedness and response, or election security this Congress. Shocking for a committee born out of 9/11 attacks, which once had a reputation for rising above the partisan politics to help secure the homeland on behalf of the American people. The committee's legislative work has suffered too. By this time last Congress, the committee had reported 49 measures, and that was during a global pandemic. This Congress, by contrast, the full committee has reported fewer than half that number. This is what happens when Republicans make someone who espouses political violence, pushes anti-Semitic tropes, and want to defund the FBI, the de facto leader of their party. This is what happens when Republicans prioritize the whims of extreme MAGA members over politics that serve the American people. It is chaos and dysfunction by design. If you don't believe me, just look at how long it took us to elect a speaker. We did nothing but vote after vote after vote. And to add insult to injury, Democrats were accused of slowing things down. And we are the minority party. We're not in charge. If Republicans are looking for someone to hold accountable, they should start looking in the mirror. Through it all, Secretary Mayorkas has remained steadfast. He continues to do his job across the department's many critical homeland security missions, including border security and immigration enforcement. He's used the full range of authorities at his disposal and stretched the resources provided by Congress to secure the border. Under his leadership, the department has removed record levels of migrants, detained more people than Congress had provided funding for, and prevented unprecedented amounts of fentanyl from entering our communities. Republicans talk a lot about supporting border security, but you know, talk is cheap. If Republicans were serious about improving conditions along the border, they would provide the department the funding necessary to do so. Instead, the majority of committee Republicans, a dozen in fact, including the chairman, voted no on providing DHS the funds it needs to secure the border. Republicans have also refused to consider the border security supplemental funding the department requested months ago, starving DHS and its frontline personnel of the money they need to carry out their duties. Americans aren't fooled by these Republican political games. They understand that where you invest your resources speak to what you really value. If Republicans valued border security like they claim, they would pay for it. I want to hear Secretary Mayorkas today about the administration's budget requests for the Department of Homeland Security. I want to ask how we can support the department, its mission, and its 260,000 dedicated personnel. That is our responsibility, and it has one I know our Democratic members take seriously. Mr. Chairman, this committee can do better. It has done better under leadership from chairmen of both parties. I look forward to returning to better days on this committee. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted to the record. We are pleased to have Secretary Mayorkas here, and I would ask the Secretary to please rise and raise his right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the Secretary has answered in the affirmative. Thank you, sir. You may be seated. I'd now like to formally introduce our witness. Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is the 7th Secretary of Homeland Security, a role in which he served since February the 2nd, 2021. Prior to his appointment, he served as the Deputy Secretary of DHS and the Director of USCIS. I thank you for being here today, sir. The witness's full statement will appear in the record, and I now recognize Secretary Mayorkas for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members of this committee. Every day, the 268,000 men and women of the Department of Homeland Security carry out our mission to protect the safety and security of the American people. They protect our shores, harbors, skies, cyberspace, borders, and leaders. They stop fentanyl and other deadly drugs from entering our country. They lead the response to maritime emergencies. As we speak, they are engaged in the response to the tragic Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore. They help communities recover and rebuild after a natural disaster. They combat the scourges of human trafficking, forced labor, and online child sexual exploitation, and so much more. All this despite a perennially insufficient budget. The dedicated public servants of DHS deserve full support, and the American people deserve the results a fully resourced DHS can deliver. The funding opportunities outlined in the President's fiscal year 2025 budget for DHS are critical to meeting both goals. I welcome the opportunity to discuss this proposed budget and highlight some of its key proposals with you today. When our department was founded in the wake of 9/11, the threat of foreign terrorism against high-visibility targets was our primary concern. That foreign threat persists, but we now also confront the terrorism-related threat of radicalized lone offenders and small groups already resident here in the United States. This budget provides for an $80 million increase to our department's nonprofit security grant program and additional funds for targeted violence and terrorism prevention grants so that DHS can better help communities prevent tragedies from occurring. As lone actors and nation states increasingly target our critical infrastructure and our data, the President's budget provides CISA with needed funding to improve our cybersecurity and resiliency. Fentanyl is wreaking tragedy in communities across the country. DHS has interdicted more illicit fentanyl and arrested more individuals for fentanyl-related crimes in the last 2 fiscal years than in the previous 5 combined. The President's budget includes critical funding to advance our strategy, including funds for non-intrusive inspection technology and targeted operations. During a time when the world, including our hemisphere, is experiencing the greatest displacement of people since World War II, DHS has toughened our border enforcement and is maximizing our available resources and authorities. In the last 11 months, we have removed or returned more than 630,000 individuals who did not have a legal basis to stay, more than in every full fiscal year since 2013. The President's budget would further expand these efforts. It provides funding for hiring more enforcement personnel and bolstering refugee processing. Our immigration system, however, is fundamentally broken. Only Congress can fix it. Congress has not updated our immigration enforcement laws since 1996, 28 years ago. And only Congress can deliver on our need for more Border Patrol agents, asylum officers, and immigration judges, facilities, and technology. Our administration worked closely with a bipartisan group of senators to reach agreement on a national security supplemental package, one that would make the system changes that are badly needed and give DHS the tools and resources needed to meet today's border security challenges. We remain ready to work with you to pass this tough, fair, bipartisan agreement. Finally, extreme weather continues to devastate communities. Last year, FEMA responded to more than 100 disasters. Our budget provides $22.7 billion to assist community leaders and help survivors in the aftermath of major disasters, and additional funds to invest in resilient strategies that will save lives and taxpayer money in the decades to come. Essential to our success across all mission sets is our department's ability to recruit and retain a world-class workforce. In addition to the frontline border workforce I mentioned, the President's budget includes $1.5 billion to maintain our commitment to fairly compensate the TSA workforce. The recently passed 2024 budget, though welcome and helpful to many of our operations, was enacted too late to implement an appreciable hiring surge. It reduced by 20% much-needed support for cities dealing with migrant-related challenges, and it cut critical research and development funding. I am eager to work with you to address these and other shortfalls in the weeks ahead, as I am eager to deliver the sustained funding, resources, and support that the extraordinarily talented and dedicated public servants of DHS need and deserve.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. And I'd like to say the Secretary has, I think, a hard out today, and that hard out is going to come up much faster than we would want or desire. I understand he's got a busy schedule. Typically, my policy is to let people go beyond the 5 minutes if they're making a question and continuing a train of thought. Unfortunately, today we're not going to be able to allow that, and I hate that. But as I've applied the rule evenly to both sides, I will now apply for today's hearing the 5 minutes with the gavel for both sides of the aisle. So it's 5 minutes and 5 minutes only, because we want to allow everyone here to get an opportunity to ask questions of the Secretary. And I'd like to ask the staffs on both sides if they would communicate this change for today to the individuals who aren't present right now. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Secretary, you've issued guidance that directed DHS personnel to essentially disregard the I nay shall detain language, meaning disregard the laws passed by Congress. You've created pathways for tens of thousands of migrants from very specific countries to enter the United States directly without any law passed by Congress and in violation of the INA. The Solicitor General, in arguments before the Supreme Court, arguing on your and your boss's behalf, as well as yourself in testimony to Congress, have said you've had prosecutorial discretion, I think is the term that keeps getting used, to disregard those laws when the resources are overwhelmed. So that's essentially been the argument that, shall detain language could not be adhered to because the resources were overwhelmed. Is that generally correct?
No, it is not. Mr. Chairman, let me assure you that we enforce the laws that Congress has passed, and that is the direction that I have given to the workforce throughout my tenure.
Well, during the hearing or the court trial, Texas versus the United States, the Solicitor General made it very clear that the reason the policies that you've written have been written the way they've been written is because there's some form of discretion allowed to make the choice that we're not going to, follow the shall detain. And we can get thousands and thousands of examples of where that didn't happen. We have a memorandum from you that basically says, just because it says this doesn't mean you have to, that's a reason to not, or to detain someone. I want to ask this question. Do you know how many ICE detention beds were empty on average during your tenure?
Mr. Chairman, let me be very clear that we maximize the use of detention beds that are available. Sometimes we are curtailed by using detention beds by reason of orders, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
But do you know the number? I'm just kind of going for the number.
By orders of court. For example, certain restrictions were used in terms of space and availability of beds by reason of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, let me just share what has been put out in documents from your department. In each year of your tenure, there have been, I would submit, thousands of beds available per day, roughly 9,000 on average in FY22, 3,000 a day in FY23, meaning while you assert that shall detain is what you want to do, what you agree the law says, we're leaving thousands of beds empty every day. And this is not counting the various, I think it's in California, starts with an A, I can't think of the name of the facility, where the courts have ordered you not to use those beds. We're not including those in these counts. And it's thousands, at least 3,000 a day empty, and yet the arguments before the Supreme Court and in your testimonies before here to Congress have been that the resources are overwhelmed and therefore we have to just catch and release these people into the country. I mean, in your opening statement, you said we need more resources. It's interesting, though, in that claim for more resources so that we can adhere to the laws, you're actually in this budget decreasing the requested ICE detention beds. So that seems to me to be illogical. If the reason we can't enforce the laws as they're written on the books is because we don't have enough resources, there are thousands of empty beds, and we're going to ask for less beds in this budget. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. And I would submit to you that it speaks to somewhat of an intent to not adhere to that shall detain. But that's my perception on this. Let me ask you this question. Just recently, your last trip here, you actually admitted that there was a crisis at the southwest border. What changed?
Mr. Chairman, nothing changed. I have recognized the enormous challenge that the southern border presents ever since I began my tenure, and actually well before that, then when I served as a deputy secretary.
Let me ask this question then. When you came to Congress and said there was no crisis at the southern border in your first few trips here, no crisis, there's no, it's secure, the border's secure, nothing changed between then and now you're saying it's a crisis?
Mr. Chairman, I have never minimized the challenge that the southern border presents. I didn't minimize it when I served as a federal prosecutor for 12 years from 1989 through 2001.
I'm going to gavel myself since I have 5 seconds left, and I now recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much. Again, welcome, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, Republicans have wasted little time playing political games with our southern border while rejecting any serious solution and voting against border security funding. If you are for it, you should support resources. If you are against it, I assume you vote against it because you're not for it. So I don't know why it happens, but Democrats historically have supported robust funding for DHS. Is DHS a perfect agency? Of course not. None of our agencies. We strive for perfection, but we understand resources are absolutely important. Republicans have tried to starve DHS personnel of the resources needed to do their job. The chairman said, not another dime for DHS. When it comes time to fund the department, I guess addressing the surge in migration and stopping fentanyl and human trafficking isn't worth 10 cents to the Republicans charged with overseeing DHS. Republicans have ignored or voted against every opportunity to provide necessary resources to DHS. They voted no on the 2023 omnibus. They refused to consider the president's supplemental request, and they called the bipartisan Senate border bill dead on arrival within minutes of the text being released. Disturbingly, just a few weeks ago, 2/3 of the Republicans on this committee voted against funding DHS and border security. Republicans have taken their marching orders from Donald Trump, and he wants chaos at the border to help his chances in this election. They want a show, not solutions. Democrats are united in finding solutions and providing the agents and officers of DHS with the resources needed to do so safely and effectively. Mr. Secretary, can you describe how the additional resources in the President's emergency supplemental or the bipartisan Senate border bill would help the department address the issues at the southern border?
Ranking Member Thompson, the President's supplemental would provide us with vital resources needed to hire additional personnel across the spectrum of our workforce that enforce the southern border and do so much more. The bipartisan Senate legislation would not only resource our department as we are needed to address a broken immigration system, but also, and very importantly, actually change the law and authorize us to use tools that have long been needed to address that broken immigration system. It would take a multi-year asylum process and reduce it to as little as 90 days or even less. That is a game changer in terms of deterring illegal migration to our border.
Thank you. Let's go to election security. We have elections coming up this November. And as you know, DHS is responsible for securing critical infrastructure, including our elections. Following Russian attempts to interfere with the 2016 elections, officials from across the Trump administration worked to counter efforts to undermine confidence in election outcomes. Unfortunately, after inciting a riot at the Capitol because he wasn't reelected, Donald Trump spent 4 years making legitimate election security work so politically toxic that I'm worried that the federal government is reluctant to support election officials and other stakeholders the way it should headed this November. Last week's baseless claim about voter fraud by the former president and speaker will only make the work of the election officials harder. Mr. Secretary, Secretaries of State, local election officials, and other stakeholders relied on DHS's support to administer secure elections in 2020. Can you assure us that DHS will bring the full range of its resources to support the 2024 elections?
Yes, I can, Ranking Member.